This episode goes out to Liam in Bakersfield, California.
Hi there, Megan Robinson here. Welcome to the third episode of the Nightblade Epic Podcast, Season 2. We're not going to take up much of your time before today's show, but we did want to remind you that the Nightblade Epic Volume 1 audiobook is out on Audible. You can buy it right now at underrealm.net/audio. So far, we've given you about 10 hours of story in this podcast. Well, the Nightblade Epic Volume 1 is close to 30 hours of audiobook. That's because it's 3 books in one, plus the addenda. More than an hour of extra essays and documents about the world and history of Underrealm. And it's all for just one Audible credit. Find it and all our audiobooks at underrealm.net/audio. That's underrealm.net/audio. Okay, now it's time for today's episode. When we left off, Lauren, Jem, and Jordell had been searching for Anis and Zane when they stumbled upon an entire army of soldiers in the kingdom of Selvin. Enjoy!
Mystic, Chapter 3. Jordell snatched Lauren's shoulder and threw her to the ground. She heard the small thud of Jem's tiny frame hitting the grass a moment later. "Hold perfectly still," said Jordell, falling beside her. "Do not move a muscle." But already Lauren could tell they had nothing to fear. The nearest tents lay far away, and even the sentries stood too distant to be easily seen. She studied the force. Lauren knew herself to be terrible at numbers, but she thought there must be several hundreds of foot soldiers and 100 or more of horses. These were on the far side of the army, though Lauren knew she and her friends would be ridden down in no time if the alarm were raised. The army did not look like Lauren thought an army ought to. When old Bracken had told her stories of great battles, he had spoken of men all in their king's colors, blue and white for Selvin, red and yellow for Dorsey, and every other kingdom with its scheme. But now she saw men wearing every color under the sky, from bright and vivid hues to dull browns and grays. She saw many gathered with bows and many in another part of the camp with spears, but none of the organization she would have expected. "What kingdom do they hail from?" she murmured. "No kingdom," said Jordell with a firm set to his jaw. "These are mercenaries." "Well, that is good. I feared for a moment that some foe had crossed into Selvin." Lauren did not know much of the machinations between the 9 lands, but even children knew that Dorsey often launched raids on the kingdoms that lay upon its borders, which was all of them, if you counted the oceans. "They may have yet," said Jordell. "We do not know whom these men serve, and I would wager that, like as not, they do not owe allegiance to Selvin." "What is it?" said Jem. He tried to wriggle up between them to the hill's crown. Lauren shoved him back. "I must get closer," murmured Jordell. "If I could but speak with one of them." Jem was undaunted and had moved to Lauren's other side. Now he sidled up behind her like a worm. He gave a low whistle between his teeth. "An army proper, and no mistake," he whispered. "One more sight I never saw in Cabris." "We could approach a sentry," Lauren suggested. "Approach a sentry without identifying yourself, and you ask for the arrow they will plant in your brain." Jordell shook his head. "No, I must enter the camp." "Enter the camp?" squeaked Jem. "Filled with soldiers who may want to kill you?" "I have faced greater perils before," said Jordell mildly. "Men do not often look for danger among their own comrades." "And I look for danger not at all," said Jem. "I will see you back at the carriage." He turned to scamper away down the hillside. Lauren whirled on him. "Do not run off by yourself, you fool!" "I run alone towards safety," he called back. "You go accompanied towards peril. Who is the fool?" He did not slow his pace, and soon he had disappeared behind the crest of the next hill. Lauren gave a low growl. "Let him be," said Jordell. "He is right, and will be safer at Seth's side." "Not when I get hold of him," muttered Lauren. "He needs a stern lesson in following orders." Jordell chuckled. "I shall leave such lessons to you. Now, let us approach the camp." Lauren drew back. "You mean for me to come with you?" "Unless you would wait here, but you have a witty tongue, and quick words might serve well to lower their guard." Lauren felt tiny pinpricks of pleasure, and was not humble enough to be ashamed of them. "Very well. It is a relief to deal with one who prefers a ready word to a ready sword." "Come then, walk as I do, and try to look as though you belong, and whatever you do, do not reveal your dagger. I wish now that you had left it at the carriage. Come." Many small bushes and trees lay between them and the sentries, a line of men clearly visible halfway to the army. Each soldier was tall and grim, and carried a longbow of yew. Jordell led her from cover to cover, but still Lauren felt exposed before those mighty bows, which were nearly as tall as the sentries themselves. She was surprised to see how easily the mystic moved. His feet fell soft and quiet as her own, and he melted into the terrain like a woodsman. Lauren realized suddenly that she knew little about this man, the lands of his birth, or how he was raised. Mayhap he too had grown up in a forest. The thought held a curious appeal, and she resolved to ask him once they were safely back at camp. Soon they had neared the sentry line, and there Jordell stopped. They hid behind a cleft in two hills, where a tumble of rocks let them hide while still peeking out to sea. But the sentries ranged across a line of unbroken ground, with no chance to slip by undetected. Always they kept their eyes turned outwards. Jordell studied them for a long while Lauren tried to imagine what he was looking at. "They are most watchful," said Lauren. "They are. What do you think that means?" Lauren thought about it, surprised by the question. It sounded like a test. "If they are watchful, they fear an attack." Her thoughts moved slowly, but they gained speed as the pieces assembled. "And here in Selvin, the most likely attack they could expect would come from the king's army. But if they fear a strike from Selvin, then Selvin did not hire them." "Good, good," murmured Jordell. "Who then?" "If they came from the east, as it would seem from their march, they could be from Wadeland. But this far south, I would wager they swear to Dorsey." "And what else? Which direction do they travel, and why?" Lauren's smile turned to a frown. "West and somewhat south. They do not move for the capital or the great cities then. What lies west of here?" "Precious little until one finds Wellmont at the southern foot of the Great Rocks. But if they were to turn south now, they would come upon Red Brook, where the King's Road meets the Dragon's Tail River. That would be my guess, though it is an ill thought." Lauren's head spun at the names of so many unfamiliar things. "I do not understand. I have never heard of these places. Are they important?" "Yes, for many reasons, but now is not the time for a lesson in politics or in history. Suffice to say that it is now more urgent than ever that we find this army's purpose." "But how can we slip between them?" said Lauren. "We will not become invisible just because we know their allegiance." "Agreed." Jordell sighed. "What I would not give for a wizard to distract them. I had hoped to walk among them without bloodshed." Lauren felt a chill and turned to Jordell with a frown. "Bloodshed? You do not mean to kill them?" He turned to meet her with a steady gaze, and Lauren felt suddenly uncomfortable before his light blue eyes. but he spoke in a voice of deep calm and not of wrath. "I would not take a life except at great need." "At utmost need, and mayhap not even then," said Lauren. "I thought you preferred a sharp tongue to a blade." "Always, and I would that we lived in a world where no blood ever need be spilt. But—" "No!" barked Lauren, louder than she meant to. They both ducked on reflex, peering out at the sentries again, but her shout had gone unheard. "No," she repeated in a murmur. "I have heard honeyed words before, coaxing me to admit that murder was needed. I did not listen then, nor will I now. If you mean to kill anyone, leave me free from it. Do these sentries threaten your life?" "Not yet, but one small army in the wrong place could spell the doom of many." "That man," Lauren insisted, pointing at the sentry straight ahead of them. "What has he done? Is he a villain? Does he plot the overthrow of Selvin? What is his crime that you would lop off his head?" Jordell looked at the sentry and then turned to study Lauren. He stayed silent so long she feared he was gathering his anger to lash out at her, either with words or with his hands. She braced herself to run. Instead, his breath came out in a long, whispering sigh before he spoke. "You are right." Lauren blinked. "I am?" "You are. Many claim to spill blood only when they must. Few who say so can live up to their words. I forgot myself for a moment, but you have reminded me. I am sorry." Lauren could find no reply. No one, not her father, not Damaris, nor Auntie, had ever taken her side. Most took her for a fool child, unwise in the ways of the world. Even Jem and Annis, who were younger than she was. Before she could answer, or Jordell could speak further, they heard a shout and the clamor of hooves. They ducked behind the rocks, Jordell's hand flying to his sword hilt. Together they peeked through a gap in the rocks. From over the hills came flying 2 mercenaries on horseback, outriders for the army. They carried long lances and had small bucklers on their arms, but Lauren spent little time studying the riders after she spied the bundle slung across the back of one of their saddles. It was a small figure tied up and strapped to the horse, and that figure was Jem. Mystic, Chapter 4. The head of one of the sentries snapped up, and he knocked an arrow as he stepped forwards, but one of the riders called out, "Twin lights!" and the sentry lowered his bow. The riders pulled to a stop not far from the rocks where Jordell and Lauren lay, and the sentry came forwards to meet them. "Well met," said the sentry. "What have you there?" "A small creature scuttling through these hills," said one of the riders. "He has a shifty look to him, and his eyes are wide enough to see too much." The sentry came to Jem and grabbed the boy's hair, jerking his head up to look at his face. Jem winced with pain, but a gag muffled his cry. Lauren went to move forwards, but Jordell restrained her with a hand on her arm. "We must help him," whispered Lauren. "Hold a moment," said Jordell. "I'm thinking." "He is more than a decade from being a man," declared the sentry. "You never can tell with spies," said the rider. "I've heard the King of Selvin recruits them this young, so that you would never look at them twice. And spy or not, one set of prying eyes is as bad as the next." "True enough," grunted the sentry. "Off with him then. They've put the cages in the—" "Hail!" said Jordell, jumping to his feet and dragging Lauren with him. They stepped out from the rocks as the sentry and outriders turned in astonishment. Once again the sentry's bow leaped up, but Jordell raised both hands and cried, "Twin lights!" The bow lowered, but slowly, and the sentry's frown remained. On the horse's back, Jem's eyes grew wide, and he ceased his struggling against the bonds that held him. "I do not know your face," said the sentry. "What are you doing out here?" I do not know most of the faces here, said Jordell, shrugging amiably. I am Bricken's man, a new one picked up on the road. One of the outriders looked at the other, frowning.
Bricken? I do not know a Bricken. I know 3, replied the other. Brickens run rampant in this land, an odd name, but common as weeds.
Lauren studied them curiously. The outriders spoke in strange voices and had brown skin darker than most in Selvin. Black hair spilled to their shoulders, and they stood shorter than those who dwelt in the birchwood. She wondered where they hailed from. But she had looked long and had finally drawn their notice. The sentry nodded at her.
Who is that one? He growled. Not one of ours, I know, for she is far too young.
No, indeed, said Jordell. I have traveled through these parts before, and I knew of a farmhouse not far away. I went to visit, and the girl wished to see the army. The outriders looked slyly at each other, and even the sentry's face seemed to lighten. Lauren's cheeks burned as she understood their thoughts, but the lie was told and she had little choice but to play along. So she let her blush deepen and ducked her head under her cowl as she giggled. I never thought to find so many of you here, she said, letting her voice quiver. It is like seeing the great war hosts of old, something from father's stories. Jem rolled his eyes at her words, she noticed with annoyance. She wanted to cuff him. The riders guffawed, but the sentry scowled at Lauren and turned to Jordell. This is no place for sightseeing. She shall remember our numbers as well as any enemy's spy. Jordell waved a hand airily. She has no wish to return home just yet, nor if she did so would any think to ask her about us. Mayhap she will travel with me for a while. Lauren tittered again and turned away as if bashful. If I would be no burden. Again the outriders laughed. One of them used the butt of his lance to jostle the sentry on foot.
No burden she would be indeed, eh? I say good for the man. Yes, leave them be, friend, said the other rider. She looks a pretty thing. He grinned at Lauren and winked. She blushed deeper. Jordell's hand moved to his side where his sword hung ready. The air went chill, as though from a sudden wind, and the mystic's voice came sharp as steel. You misunderstand me, friends. This girl is the daughter of one who trusts me. She wishes to travel to distant lands and nothing more. Surely no warrior of Dull Moon would think to press himself unwelcome, even in this faraway land. A sellsword should have more honor. The rider shook his head quickly. You mistake me, friend. I am not fool enough to invite the king's harshest law. Jordell relaxed. I'm glad to hear tales of Dulmish gallantry are no exaggeration. But what of your own passenger? That is no quail strung across your saddle, though he looks small enough to be. This one? The rider reached back and thumped Jem's back hard enough to draw a groan. Mayhap a spy, or simply a small child on his own, far from home. It hardly matters. He will get the question all the same, and like as not a swift end. You know the captain. Silent and swift, he says again and again. Until I think my ears might fall off, said Jordell with a nod. But this one hardly looks to be a spy. Not even Selvin gets them this young. He moved like one, and he squealed like one when we caught him, said the rider. And now I think we had best be getting him on, for I have been too long without a meal. Lauren's gut clenched. Struck by an idea, she wandered forwards, her eyes wonderstruck. She came to Jem, who stared at her with pleading eyes. But this is only the little boy from the next farm over. Her voice was sing-song, airy and vacant, like a girl somewhat overwhelmed by the world. I have known him since he was born, and a ripe little squealer he has always been. She raised her eyes to the rider, all innocence and curiosity.
Everything fell dead silent, and both outriders glared at Lauren in sudden suspicion. Their gaze drifted to Jordell behind her, and she felt a sinking hole grow in her stomach. Jem winced, as though in pain. What had she done?
"He told us he was a riverman's son," said one of the riders, "wandering off from his father's boat while it rested on the bank."
Lauren's mouth fell open, but she could find no words. She had grown suddenly very aware of the size of the men on horseback, and of the sentry standing unseen somewhere behind her.
"So, river boy or farmer's son," growled the other rider. "Which lie to believe? Mayhap we have laid hands on 2 spies instead of 1. Or mayhap 3 of—"
the other began, turning towards Jordell, but he never finished, for the mystic leaped forwards with drawn sword and hacked the front legs from beneath the man's mount. The warrior pitched to the ground with a cry, and Jem tumbled from the saddle into the grass with a sharp groan. Lauren seized the boy by his bonds and dragged him away from the horse's flailing rear hooves as the creature screamed on the ground in agony. Lauren stood just in time to see Jordell strike again. This time his blade plunged into the chest of the second rider, and the man fell dumbstruck from the saddle. Jordell gripped the reins with his sword hand as he spun, shoving them into Lauren's grip. She took them without thinking. Jordell jumped forwards, for the other rider had regained his feet. The taller man dropped his lance in favor of a curved blade at his waist, but in 3 quick strokes Jordell had struck the weapon away. His blade flashed in the sunlight once more, and the rider sank to his knees. His head rolled away through the grass, spurting blood. Lauren wanted to scream, but she was struck dumb. Her eyes darted to the last man, the sentry on foot, and she saw him with an arrow nocked and at full draw. He stood well out of reach of Jordell's sword, and finally Lauren raised her voice in a shout, trying to warn the mystic, even though it was surely too late. The sentry let fly. The bowstring twanged. But just as it did, Jordell threw his knife from his belt. It was a wild throw, and the blade missed the sentry by more than a pace, but it threw off his aim. The arrow flew wide and sank deep into the ground paces behind him, buried up to the fletching. Lauren joined the sentry in a disbelieving gape, even as Jordell lunged, even as his sword took first the archer's hand and then lay open his chest and finally split the man's head nearly in half down the middle. Red spurted across Jordell's body, spattering his face, his silvery hair, his light tunic, but Lauren had grown numb to the blood, to the fighting and killing she had wanted so badly to avoid. She could only see the arrow, missing him by a hand's breadth. He turned and came to her quickly. Lauren shied away, but he dropped to his knee beside Jem and drew the dirk from his boot. In a moment the boy's bonds were cut and the gag removed from his mouth. Thank you, gasped Jem. Up, said Jordell, but he did not wait before raising the boy by the shoulders. He took the reins from Lauren and leaped into the saddle, seizing Jem's wrist and dragging the boy up to sit before him. Come, Lauren, quickly. Jordell held out a hand, ready to pull her up behind him. Lauren could only stare, unable to move. A horn blast split the air. A ways off she saw a sentry looking at them, horn raised to his lips. Another blast cut the air, and the sellsword army erupted like a hill of ants. Lauren saw many men leaping to horseback throughout the camp. Lauren, barked Jordell, if we do not leave at once, our corpses will join theirs. Come. Lauren hated it, but she could see the truth in his words. She raised her hand and let Jordell pull her up, sliding into the saddle behind him. She wrapped her arms around his wide chest, linking her hands so she did not have to press her palms against him. Jem bounced back against her wrists as the mystic spurred the horse in a circle, climbing over the rise behind them and down the other side, riding east as fast as they could, while the mercenaries roiled behind them.
This has been a production of Legacy Books, written and narrated by Garrett Robinson. The music in this podcast was created by Will Musser. Check out his incredible work at willmusser.com. That's WILLMUSSER.com. Today's letter is V. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.